Picture a city that defied the very idea of limits. Its walls were so immense, so formidable, that they were considered utterly unbreachable, a permanent scar on the landscape of human ambition. This was Babylon at the zenith of its power, a metropolis that gathered the wealth and knowledge of the ancient world beneath its towering ziggurats. Its hanging gardens were a marvel of engineering, a lush green mountain built for a queen, and its streets pulsed with the energy of countless cultures and languages. It was the very definition of an unshakable empire, a monument to humanity's capacity to build something meant to last forever. And then, in the space of a single night, it all came crashing down. The most magnificent city on earth simply vanished from the stage of history, not through a slow decay, but in one violent, earth-shattering evening. The echo of that collapse was so profound that it rippled across continents and centuries, leaving behind one of history's most enduring and captivating mysteries. What really happened on the night Babylon fell? The truth is, there is no single story. The fall of Babylon is not a monolithic event recorded by one impartial observer. Instead, it is a rich and complex tapestry, woven from the threads of many different civilizations, each with its own agenda, its own fears, and its own version of the truth. The Persian conquerors told a tale of brilliant strategy and liberation. The Greek historians spun a dramatic narrative of royal decadence and divine punishment. The biblical prophets saw it as the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy, a moment of cosmic justice delivered by the hand of God. Every empire that witnessed the event or heard its echo recorded it not just as history, but as a story that served their own understanding of the world. They mythologized its demise, turning a military conquest into a legend that would explain everything from the nature of power to the will of the gods. This is why the mystery still captivates us today, because each version reveals a different facet of the truth, and in comparing them, we learn less about one night in antiquity and more about how history itself is written. In this video, we will embark on a journey to unravel this multi-civilization retelling. We will sit with the Persian chroniclers and examine the famous Cyrus cylinder, their official proclamation of a bloodless victory. We will step into the Athenian symposia where Herodotus shared his tales of Eastern hubris and the famous writing on the wall. And we will listen to the powerful, ominous voices of the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, who saw Babylon's collapse as a foretold doom. By piecing together these conflicting accounts, we will attempt to separate fact from legend, strategy from propaganda, and divine intervention from political necessity. This is a deep dive into one of history's greatest puzzles, a story that fundamentally challenges our understanding of what we think we know about the past. The echoes of that night didn't just shape the ancient world, they continue to shape our perception of empire, power, and the inevitable fall of giants. Our exploration begins by stepping back in time to witness the glory of Babylon itself, to understand the sheer scale of what was lost, and to appreciate the awe-inspiring power of the empire whose downfall would become a legend for the ages. Sunlight strikes the glazed blue bricks of the Ishtar Gate, setting them ablaze with the color of a deep, sacred sky. Lions, dragons, and bulls molded from gold and enamel seem to stride across its surface, a procession of divine power welcoming all who enter. This was the grand entrance to Babylon, the heart of an empire that believed itself to be as eternal as the gods it worshipped. Under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century before the Common Era, the city was not merely a capital, it was a statement. It was the largest, most magnificent metropolis on earth, a sprawling testament to human ambition where the very air seemed to hum with power and possibility. To walk its streets was to witness the pinnacle of ancient civilization, a place where the impossible had been made manifest. The city's defenses were the stuff of legend, designed to crush the spirit of any potential attacker before a single arrow was loosed. Historians like Herodotus would later describe walls so wide that 2 chariots, each drawn by 4 horses, could pass each other on the ramparts without touching. These were not simple barriers of stone and mud brick, they were an entire landscape of fortification. An immense outer wall encircled an even more massive inner wall, and beyond them lay a moat filled by the waters of the Euphrates River itself. The message was unequivocal. Babylon was untouchable, a fortress whose strength was both physical and psychological. For the people living within, and for the nations that paid it tribute, these walls created an aura of absolute invincibility. The idea that this city could ever fall was not just unlikely, it was unthinkable, a contradiction of the natural order. Beyond its military might, Babylon thrived as a cosmopolitan hub, a dizzying crossroads of the world. Its markets overflowed with spices from India, silver from Anatolia, and textiles from the Levant. The city buzzed with a cacophony of languages: Aramaic, Akkadian, Greek, and Egyptian, as merchants, diplomats, and scholars mingled in its shadowy streets. This was a center of profound learning, where priests meticulously tracked the movements of planets across the night sky, laying the foundations for modern astronomy. Their precise calculations allowed them to predict eclipses and create sophisticated calendars, knowledge that reinforced the belief that Babylon was in harmony with the cosmos itself. The city's greatness was not just in its wealth but in its intellect, a beacon of progress in an ancient world. Then there were the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though their exact location remains a mystery to archaeologists, ancient sources describe a breathtaking artificial mountain of terraced gardens, rising high above the flat Mesopotamian plain. A complex system of screws and pumps, a marvel of hydraulic engineering, drew water from the Euphrates to irrigate a lush collection of trees, shrubs, and flowers from distant lands. The gardens were a symbol of a king's power to define nature itself, to create a verdant paradise in the middle of a sun-scorched desert. They represented the ultimate expression of Babylon's capability. If they could build this, what couldn't they do? As historian Paul Kruaksek illustrates in his work, the psychological impact of such a city cannot be overstated. For its inhabitants and its rivals, Babylon was more than a city. It was an idea, the very definition of permanence and power. This is the crucial foundation for the mystery we are about to explore. The sheer scale of Babylon's achievement, the depth of its knowledge, and the brute strength of its defenses make its eventual collapse not just a historical event, but a profound shock. The dramatic irony is palpable. Everyone living in that era, from the wealthiest merchant to the lowliest soldier, operated under the assumption that the empire was unshakable. Its permanence was a fact of life, as reliable as the rising sun. This widespread belief makes the story of its fall so much more than a tale of military conquest. It becomes a puzzle that forces us to question everything we think we know about power, about security, and about the vulnerabilities that can hide in plain sight, even within the most powerful fortress. How could such an absolute powerhouse, a city that seemed to have anticipated and neutralized every possible threat, be brought to its knees in a single night? Yet the campfires of Cyrus the Great's army, visible from the highest towers of Babylon, told a different story. They did not blaze with the frantic energy of an army preparing for a bloody siege. Instead, they glowed with a quiet, confident patience. The Persian king, a master of strategy, understood that the greatest walls are not made of brick, but of the will of the people who live behind them. His approach was not one of brute force, but of brilliant cunning, a campaign meticulously documented on a small, barrel-shaped clay object known today as the Cyrus cylinder. This artifact is our primary window into the official Persian narrative, and it paints a picture not of a violent conquest, but of a calculated liberation. According to this version of events, the fall of Babylon was a near bloodless affair, a masterstroke of psychological and tactical warfare. The cylinder describes how Cyrus, rather than battering down the legendary walls, turned the city's greatest asset into its greatest vulnerability, the mighty Euphrates River. The story goes that his engineers undertook a massive project to divert the river's flow, lowering the water level enough for his special forces to wade into the city through the riverbed gates under the cover of night. And this was not just any night. It was during the annual Akitu festival, a time of grand celebration when the entire city, including its guards, would be immersed in religious rituals and feasting. The implication is profound. The Persians didn't break in, they walked in. This narrative was far from accidental. It was a masterpiece of political propaganda designed for a very specific purpose. Cyrus needed to legitimize his rule over the most prestigious empire in the known world. He could not simply be seen as a foreign conqueror. He had to be presented as a legitimate ruler, even a chosen one. The Cyrus cylinder achieves this with breathtaking audacity. It claims that the Babylonian god Marduk himself had rejected the city's last king, Nabonidus, for his impiety and neglect. The text reads, quote, "He Marduk scanned and looked through all the countries, searching for a righteous ruler willing to lead him. Then he pronounced the name of Cyrus, king of Anshan, declared him to become the ruler of all the world." End quote. In this framing, Cyrus is not an invader but a liberator, summoned by the Babylonians' own chief deity to restore order and proper religious worship. He is portrayed as entering Babylon, amidst celebration and joy, greeted by the grateful populace as a savior from the unpopular rule of Nabonidus. This was a brilliant move, transforming a military conquest into a peaceful transfer of power and securing the loyalty of the powerful priestly class who had been alienated by their previous king. To understand why this propaganda was so effective, we must look at the political cracks already running through Babylon's foundations. King Nabonidus was an eccentric and controversial figure. For much of his 17-year reign, he was not even in the capital. He spent a decade in a self-imposed exile at the Arabian oasis of Tema, deeply devoted to the moon god Sin, whom he elevated above Babylon's traditional patron, Marduk. This religious shift was seen as a grave insult by the influential priests of Marduk, who held immense sway over the population. Nabonidus's long absence left the day-to-day governance of the empire in the hands of his son, Belshazzar, who, while a capable administrator, lacked the full authority of the king. This created a power vacuum and a deep sense of dissatisfaction among the Babylonian elite. Cyrus, a keen observer of his enemies, undoubtedly knew of this internal discord. The Persian narrative expertly exploits this division, presenting Cyrus not as a destroyer of Babylonian culture, but as its restorer. The cylinder boasts of his actions once in power. He returned the statues of the gods to their rightful temples, allowed displaced peoples like the Jews to return to their homelands, and repaired the city's infrastructure. It was a message of stability and tolerance, carefully crafted to assure the diverse subjects of the empire that life under Persian rule would be not just acceptable, but better. This official Persian account presents a direct challenge to the more dramatic and violent retellings that would come from other civilizations. There is no mention of a great battle within the city walls, no sack, no burning palaces. The cylinder suggests a swift, surgical takeover where the existing bureaucracy and social order were largely left intact. This perspective forces us to confront a critical question. Was the fall of Babylon truly as peaceful as Cyrus claimed, or is this a sanitized version of events, a victor's history written to consolidate power and ensure a smooth transition? The sheer sophistication of the propaganda makes it difficult to dismiss entirely. It reveals that Cyrus understood a fundamental truth about empire. Conquering a city is one thing, but governing it requires the consent, or at least the acquiescence of its people. By positioning himself as the chosen instrument of Marduk and a liberator from misrule, he aimed to conquer the minds of the Babylonians first, making the physical conquest almost a formality. This account sets the stage for a stark contrast with the Greek and biblical versions, inviting us to weigh the cool, political calculus of the Cyrus cylinder against the fiery drama of divine judgment and royal decadence. Now let us travel west to the smoky, wine-filled rooms of an Athenian symposium. Here, the air is thick with the scent of olive oil and the sound of philosophical debate, a world away from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia. It is in this setting that we encounter a radically different version of Babylon's fall, one shaped not by imperial proclamations, but by the captivating voice of a storyteller often called the father of history, Herodotus. For his Greek audience, the collapse of a mighty Eastern empire was not a dry military report. It was a thrilling drama, a cautionary tale with a clear moral. In the Greek historical tradition, empires did not fall because of clever river diversions or political discontent. They fell because of hubris, because of an arrogance that offended the gods and invited a terrible poetic justice. This perspective transforms the fall of Babylon from a strategic conquest into a timeless lesson about the dangers of excess and pride. Herodotus, writing his histories about a century after the events, presents a version of the story that is rich with vivid, almost cinematic detail. While he does mention Cyrus's tactic of diverting the Euphrates, the real focus of his account is on the moral decay within the city walls. He describes the Babylonians as being so confident in their provisions that they mocked Cyrus from their ramparts, dancing and singing in a display of utter contempt for the besieging army. This image of a populace lost in celebration while their doom approaches is a powerful narrative device. It sets the stage for the central theme of Greek historiography, that internal corruption, not external force, is the true cause of an empire's collapse. The mighty walls of Babylon in this telling were not breached by engineering alone. They were undermined from within by a failure of character. The most famous and enduring element of this Greek-influenced tradition comes not directly from Herodotus, but from the later book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible, a text that was profoundly shaped by the Hellenistic world in which it was finalized. This is the legendary story of Belshazzar's feast. The scene is one of unparalleled opulence and sacrilege. Belshazzar, the prince regent left in charge by his absent father Nabonidus, hosts a grand banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. In an act of supreme defiance, he orders that the sacred gold and silver vessels, looted from the temple in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, be brought out so that his guests can drink from them, praising the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. At the very height of this blasphemous celebration, a disembodied hand appears and writes 4 mysterious words on the plaster wall, illuminated by the lamplight: Min, Min, Tekel, Upharsin. The king is terrified, his knees knock together, and his wise men are baffled. The prophet Daniel is summoned and interprets the divine message. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The story concludes with a stark finality. That very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. This dramatic account, while likely written centuries later, perfectly encapsulates the Greek narrative lens. It has all the elements of a classic tragedy: a proud ruler, a blasphemous act, a supernatural omen, and an immediate, brutal downfall. The writing on the wall has entered our language as a universal symbol of an inevitable and dire fate. But as historians, we must approach Herodotus and the dramatic traditions with a critical eye. How reliable is this version of events? Scholars have long noted that Herodotus was writing for a Greek audience that craved exciting stories about the exotic East. His sources were often second or third-hand, filtered through translators and subject to the political biases of the time. The Greek world was in a long-standing struggle with the Persian Empire, and there was a clear incentive to portray Eastern rulers as decadent, tyrannical, and morally bankrupt. The story of Belshazzar's feast, while powerful, faces significant historical challenges. Babylonian records confirm that Belshazzar was a real historical figure, a son of Nabonidus who acted as regent. However, there is no independent record of this feast, nor of his death on the night of the conquest. In fact, the Cyrus Cylinder and the Babylonian chronicles suggest the takeover was peaceful, with no mention of a slain king. This does not mean the Greek-influenced narrative is worthless. Instead, its value lies not in its literal accuracy, but in its thematic truth. The story of Belshazzar's feast serves as a powerful explanation for why such a powerful empire could fall so quickly. For cultures that believed in a moral universe, a simple military explanation was insufficient. There had to be a deeper reason, a cosmic imbalance that required correction. The tale of royal hubris and divine retribution provided that reason. It transformed a complex geopolitical event into a satisfying parable about the limits of power and the certainty of justice. This retelling adds a profound layer of moral drama to the historical event, creating a stark and intentional contrast with the sanitized political narrative of the Cyrus Cylinder. Where Cyrus claims liberation, the Greek tradition sees punishment. Where the Persians document strategy, the Greeks dramatize sin. This invites us to consider the powerful role of narrative embellishment in shaping history. Every civilization tells the stories it needs to hear, and the Greeks needed a story that warned of the dangers of arrogance, a story that confirmed their own cultural values in opposition to those of their powerful Eastern rivals. The fall of Babylon, through this lens, becomes less about what actually happened on one night in 539 B.C.E., and more about what the event came to symbolize for the world that remembered it. But for the Jewish people living in exile within those very walls, the grand processions and towering ziggurats of Babylon were not symbols of human achievement. They were monuments to their own subjugation. This was the perspective of the prophets, voices crying out in the midst of a seemingly endless captivity. Where the Persians saw a strategic liberation and the Greeks a moral lesson, the Hebrew scriptures present the fall of Babylon as something far more profound, the undeniable fulfillment of divine prophecy. This is a narrative not of politics or hubris, but of cosmic justice, where the most powerful empire on earth is brought low by the will of a single, all-powerful God. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah, speaking generations before the event, had foretold this doom with startling specificity, transforming a future military conquest into a cornerstone of religious faith for a people who had lost everything. The language they used was not that of a military report. It was the fiery, poetic diction of apocalypse. Listen to the words of Isaiah, who decades before the Jewish exile even began, pronounced judgment on Babylon. In chapter 13, he declares, Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. This is not a simple prediction of a regime change. This is the unraveling of creation itself, a divine intervention so powerful that it shakes the very cosmos. The prophet paints a picture of total desolation, a once great city reduced to a haunt for jackals and owls, a place where no Arab would pitch his tent and no shepherd would graze his flock. This vivid imagery served a crucial purpose for a community living in despair. It assured them that their suffering was not meaningless, that their oppressor's power was an illusion in the face of their God's ultimate authority. Perhaps the most astonishing element of this prophetic narrative is its direct identification of the instrument of God's will, Cyrus the Great himself. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, the Persian king is called by name more than a century before his rise to power. The text states, "This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of to subdue nations before him. I will go before you and will level the mountains. I will break down gates of bronze and cut through bars of iron." This is a revolutionary theological concept. Cyrus, a pagan ruler who likely knew nothing of the God of Israel, is described as God's anointed, a term usually reserved for Jewish kings. He is not a free agent acting on his own ambition. He is an unwitting tool in a divine plan, chosen specifically to execute judgment on Babylon and, crucially, to free the Jewish exiles. This portrayal solves a difficult theological problem. How could a foreign conqueror be the agent of Judah's salvation? The answer provided is that God's sovereignty extends over all nations and all kings, even those who do not worship him. The successes of Cyrus from this perspective were not his own but were granted to him for a higher purpose. The prophet Jeremiah, writing during the final, traumatic years of the kingdom of Judah and the initial stages of the exile, adds another layer to this narrative. His prophecies are filled with both the bitter reality of defeat and the stubborn hope of eventual restoration. He specifically names Babylon as the agent of God's judgment against Judah for its sins, but he also firmly declares that Babylon itself will not escape accountability. In chapter 51, Jeremiah proclaims, "Babylon must fall because of Israel's slain, just as the slain in all the earth have fallen because of Babylon." This establishes a clear cycle of justice. Babylon was used as a rod of discipline, but its own arrogance and cruelty would inevitably lead to its punishment. Jeremiah's prophecy is intensely personal for the exiles. It gives them a timeline and a promise. He even specifies that the conquest would occur when the Euphrates River was dried up, a detail that eerily echoes the practical strategy described in other accounts, but here it is framed as an act of God. For the Jewish people enduring the humiliation of exile, this prophetic interpretation was not merely interesting theology, it was a lifeline. It provided a framework for understanding their traumatic experience that affirmed their identity and their faith. Instead of seeing their defeat as evidence that their God was weaker than the gods of Babylon, they could see it as part of a larger, purposeful plan. Their God was not defeated. He was using the might of Babylon to punish his people, and he would then use the might of Persia to redeem them. This narrative transformed a historical event into a testament of hope. It taught that God was in control of history, even when circumstances seemed to suggest the opposite. The fall of Babylon, therefore, became a foundational event that reinforced the core tenets of Jewish faith: the justice of God, the certainty of his promises, and his ultimate sovereignty over all the empires of the world. This spiritual dimension adds a profound layer of meaning to the fall. inviting us to consider how a single night can be interpreted not just as a shift in political power, but as a moment of transcendent cosmic significance. But what happens when we set aside the scrolls and the prophecies and instead listen to the silent testimony of the earth itself? The stories of Cyrus, Herodotus, and Isaiah are powerful, but they are echoes filtered through the agendas of those who told them. The ruins of Babylon, however, offer a different kind of evidence, a tangible, physical record that cannot lie, though it often speaks in whispers rather than shouts. Archaeology provides the critical ground truth, the scientific lens through which we can test the grandiose claims of the texts against the stubborn reality of mudbrick and stone. When we walk through the excavated remains of the city, we are not just looking at an ancient site, we are conducting an investigation into the events of that fateful night, searching for clues in the very soil upon which history unfolded. The man who first brought these whispers to the modern world was the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey. Beginning in 1899, he led a massive 18-year excavation that systematically unearthed the heart of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. His team's trowels and brushes revealed the foundations of the legendary walls, the processional way, and the brilliant blue-glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate. But for our mystery, Koldewey was searching for something very specific, a layer of destruction. If the city had been violently sacked, as the Greek and biblical dramas suggest, the archaeology should show it, a clear stratum of ash, charcoal, and collapsed buildings dating to the time of Cyrus's conquest. A violent fire leaves an unmistakable signature in the ground, a black line of carbon that archaeologists can read like a page in a book. Yet, when Koldewey and those who followed him examined the layers corresponding to the year 539 BCE, they found something far more ambiguous. There is no widespread, city-wide layer of burning. The evidence for a catastrophic conflagration is simply not there. This single, silent fact from the ground poses a serious challenge to the most dramatic versions of the story. It suggests that if there was violence, it was confined, not a general sack that put the entire city to the torch. This doesn't mean the archaeology proves the Persian account of a completely bloodless takeover. Instead, it points to a more complex reality. Excavations around the central palace and temple complexes, the symbolic hearts of Babylonian power, show evidence of changes and repairs, but not necessarily wholesale destruction. What archaeologists find is a continuity of occupation. Life in Babylon did not screech to a halt. The temples continued to function, the administrative buildings were reused. This material evidence strongly supports the idea that Cyrus's primary goal was not annihilation but assimilation. He wanted to capture the empire's administrative machinery intact. The physical layout of the city's defenses also tells a story. The remains of the massive walls and the river gates confirm the ancient descriptions of their immense scale. They were, without a doubt, a formidable obstacle. This makes the idea of a direct frontal assault seem incredibly costly and unlikely. The archaeology, therefore, indirectly lends credence to the more clever tactics described in the histories, like the diversion of the Euphrates. A direct breach against such defenses would have left a massive archaeological footprint of broken siege engines, projectile weapons, and concentrated destruction at the point of attack, evidence that is largely absent. Perhaps the most compelling archaeological evidence doesn't come from Babylon at all, but from a different site entirely, the Cyrus cylinder, which was actually discovered not in Persia, but in the ruins of Babylon by Hormuzd Rassam in 1879. This small clay object is itself an artifact, a piece of material culture that we can hold in our hands. Its very existence and its deliberate deposition in the foundations of the city is archaeological proof of the Persian propaganda campaign. It shows that Cyrus was deeply concerned with legitimizing his rule on the ground, literally embedding his version of events into the fabric of the city. The archaeology of the object confirms the text's claim that it was meant for public consumption. Furthermore, other archaeological finds, such as administrative tablets from Babylon dating to the immediate years after the conquest, show a smooth transition. The same scribes who worked for the Babylonian kings simply began dating their documents to the reign of Cyrus. There is no evidence of a breakdown in the bureaucracy, which you would expect following a violent and disruptive conquest. The material record paints a picture of remarkable stability. So, what do the ruins ultimately whisper about that night? They whisper of a takeover that was more political and strategic than militarily catastrophic. They suggest that the legendary walls were circumvented rather than shattered. The lack of a great destruction layer argues against a bloody sack, while the evidence of continuous life and administration supports the idea of a calculated regime change. The archaeology does not necessarily prove every detail of the Cyrus cylinder, but it certainly does not contradict its central thesis of a relatively peaceful transition. It forces us to re-evaluate the dramatic tales of Belshazzar's feast and the writing on the wall, seeing them less as literal history and more as powerful theological and moral commentaries. The stones and bricks of Babylon provide a crucial reality check, grounding the multi-civilization retelling in the hard, physical facts of what actually survived. They remind us that while humans write stories to explain their world, the earth itself keeps a different, often more subtle, and in many ways more reliable record. For a city built in the heart of a desert, the Euphrates River was not just a feature of the landscape, it was the very source of its life. Day and night, its steady, powerful current flowed through the center of Babylon, bringing water to its legendary gardens, sustaining its population of hundreds of thousands, and serving as a bustling aquatic highway for trade. The river was the city's economic and biological heart, a constant, reassuring presence that made the impossible metropolis viable. Yet, in a stunning reversal of fortune, this guarantor of life became, on that one night, the instrument of the city's downfall. The very element that defined Babylon's prosperity was transformed into its most critical vulnerability, a strategic opening that Cyrus the Great's army exploited with what appears to be brilliant precision. The story of the river's diversion is a linchpin connecting the Persian, Greek, and even biblical accounts, and examining its feasibility takes us from the realm of legend into the practical world of ancient military engineering. So, how does an army go about diverting one of the world's great rivers? The accounts from historians like Herodotus and Xenophon describe a massive undertaking. The plan, as they tell it, was not to stop the Euphrates entirely, an impossible task, but to lower its water level significantly within the city's walls. To achieve this, the Persian army is said to have dug a network of large canals or reservoirs upstream, creating an alternative channel that would draw water away from the main riverbed. This would have been a monumental labor, requiring thousands of soldiers working for weeks or even months, moving enormous quantities of earth with nothing but shovels and baskets. The timing would have been critical. This kind of operation would be most feasible during the late summer or early autumn, when the river's flow was at its lowest after the spring melt from the Armenian mountains. The engineering challenge was immense, but it was not beyond the capabilities of the Achaemenid Empire, which commanded resources from Egypt to India. Their engineers would have possessed sophisticated hydrological knowledge, understanding how to manipulate water on a grand scale, much as earlier Mesopotamian civilizations had done for irrigation for thousands of years. The real question is not whether it was possible, but whether it was executed exactly as the ancient sources claim. The true brilliance of the plan, if it happened this way, lay in its synchronization with the city's cultural calendar. The alleged night of the attack coincided with the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration. This was the most important religious event of the year, a multi-day ceremony involving grand processions, public feasts, and rituals centered on the king's symbolic reaffirmation of his rule with the god Marduk. The entire city would have been immersed in the festivities. More importantly, the festival held a deep political and psychological significance. It was a time for reinforcing the social order and the divine mandate of the king. For an attacking force, it presented a perfect storm of opportunity. Military vigilance along the vast walls might have been relaxed as guards participated in the celebrations. More crucially, the massive bronze gates that protected the city where the river entered and exited its walls might have been left less guarded or even opened as part of the ritual processions that characterized the festival. The Persians, through spies or informants, would have been acutely aware of this schedule. A diversion of the river during the height of the Akitu festival would mean attacking the city at the moment it was most symbolically confident in its own invincibility and potentially most physically vulnerable. This leads to one of the most intriguing possibilities, that the Persians had help from within. The political discontent with King Nabonidus, particularly among the priests of Marduk whom he had alienated, is a well-documented factor. It is not difficult to imagine that Cyrus's agents had been in contact with disaffected Babylonian nobles or priests, promising them a return to prominence under his rule. These collaborators could have provided invaluable intelligence about the festival schedule, the layout of the river gates, and the routines of the guards. They might have even played a direct role on the night itself, ensuring that a particular water gate was unbarred or that a certain patrol route was abandoned. The idea of a fifth column working from within makes the entire scenario far more plausible. A small team of Persian soldiers, guided by Babylonian conspirators, could have slipped into the city through the partially drained riverbed, avoiding the main defenses entirely. Their objective would not have been to fight the entire Babylonian army in the streets, but to seize key points, the palace gates, the citadel, creating panic and confusion, and effectively decapitating the leadership in a swift coup de main. This would explain the lack of widespread archaeological evidence for a battle. The conquest may have been a precise surgical strike rather than a city-wide melee. When we weigh this tactical detail across the different retellings, its significance becomes clear. For the Persians, the river diversion was a testament to Cyrus's strategic genius, a clever maneuver that avoided a bloody siege and minimized destruction, perfectly aligning with their narrative of a liberation. For the Greek tradition, the same event is framed within a story of Babylonian negligence and hubris, a people so lost in their revelry that they failed to guard their own lifeblood. For the biblical prophets, the drying up of the Euphrates could be seen as the hand of God, a miraculous clearing of a path for his chosen instrument, Cyrus. The practical mechanics of the river's role, therefore, act as a powerful bridge between myth and military history. It is a concrete, physical event that can be analyzed and understood, yet it is also a blank canvas onto which each civilization projected its own values and interpretations. By focusing on the Euphrates, we move closer to the actual events of that night, stripping away layers of propaganda and moralizing to reveal the clever, ruthless, and likely collaborative operation that brought the Unshakable empire to its knees. While Cyrus planned his campaign and the Greek historians later crafted their tales of decadence, the man who should have been Babylon's first line of defense was nowhere near the city. He was hundreds of miles to the south, in the arid silence of the Arabian desert, at an oasis called Tama. This was King Nabonidus, one of the most enigmatic and controversial figures in ancient Mesopotamian history. His story is not one of a weak king, but of a deeply eccentric and pious ruler whose very strengths, his intense religious devotion and his desire for cultural reform, became the fatal weaknesses that cracked open the door for Persia. To understand why Babylon fell with such apparent ease, we must first understand the king who, for a decade, turned his back on it. Nabonidus was not a born prince of Babylon. He came to power relatively late in life, likely through his connection to the royal family, possibly as a son-in-law or a high-ranking official. This background is crucial because it meant he lacked the deep, generational legitimacy of a Nebuchadnezzar. He was an outsider, and he seems to have acted like one, pursuing a religious agenda that would fundamentally alienate the establishment that sustained the throne. His great passion was not for Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon and the traditional patron of its kings, but for the moon god Sin. This was not a minor theological preference, it was a radical shift in state policy. Nabonidus elevated Sin to the highest position in the pantheon, dedicating resources and attention to his cult, particularly at the god's main cult center in the distant city of Haran. For the powerful priests of Marduk, who had enjoyed centuries of privilege and influence, this was nothing short of heresy. It was a direct challenge to their authority and the very cosmic order that justified Babylonian rule. This religious fervor culminated in a decision that still baffles historians today. Around the year 552 B.C.E., Nabonidus simply left Babylon. He departed for the Arabian oasis of Tama, and he stayed there for approximately 10 years. Ancient sources, like the later verse account of Nabonidus, which was likely composed by pro-Persian priests, paint a picture of a king gone mad. They describe him as being struck by a divine affliction, abandoning his city to wander the desert. A more plausible explanation is that Tama was a major hub on the lucrative incense trade routes, and Nabonidus may have been attempting to secure this economic lifeline and extend Babylonian influence deep into Arabia. But the perception and the lasting reality was one of shocking neglect. Imagine the psychological impact on the people of Babylon. For a decade, their king, the intermediary between the gods and the people, was absent. The great religious festivals, especially the all-important New Year Akitu festival, which required the king's participation to legitimize his rule, were either cancelled or performed by a substitute. The city, the very navel of the world, must have felt spiritually adrift. In his place, Nabonidus left his eldest son, Belshazzar, in charge as regent. Babylonian administrative tablets from this period are consistently dated to the reign of Nabonidus, but with the important notation that the son of the king was present in Babylon. Belshazzar was clearly a capable administrator, handling the day-to-day affairs of the empire, but a regent is not a king. He lacked the full divine authority of his father. He could not fully embody the role of the ruler in the crucial religious ceremonies. This created a dangerous power vacuum at the very top of the government. While Belshazzar could give orders, he could not command the same unquestioning loyalty that a present, anointed king could. This division of power sowed confusion and, most critically, alienated the priestly class even further. The priests of Marduk were now being governed by a prince who represented a king who had insulted their god. The internal unity of the Babylonian elite, so essential for facing an external threat, was shattered. This internal discord is not just a modern interpretation, it is shouted from the ancient sources themselves. The Cyrus cylinder, the Persian propaganda piece, explicitly uses this division as its central justification for conquest. It states that Nabonidus had made the people of Babylon learn a prayer that was not right for them, and that he disrupted the worship of Marduk. It claims that the god Marduk became angry and then searched for a righteous king, finding Cyrus. This is pure political spin, but it spins a thread of truth. Nabonidus was deeply unpopular with the most influential group in the city. Later Babylonian chronicles also reflect this tension, noting the king's long absence and the resultant instability. The stage was perfectly set for Cyrus. He wasn't just facing a unified empire. He was approaching a kingdom riven by internal religious and political strife, led by a regent whose authority was inherently limited, and defended by a priestly class that may have felt it had little to lose by welcoming a new ruler who promised to restore their god to his proper place. The fall of Babylon begins to look less like a military conquest and more like an inside job, facilitated by a king whose vision for his kingdom was so singular that it ultimately left the city undefended from within. Inside the palace, the air is thick with the scent of roasting meat and expensive perfumes. 1,000 of Babylon's most powerful nobles recline on couches, their golden cups overflowing with wine. At the center of it all is Belshazzar, the prince regent, ruling in the long absence of his father, King Nabonidus. In a moment of supreme arrogance, or perhaps desperate bravado, he gives an order that will echo through history. He commands that the sacred vessels of gold and silver, plundered from the temple in Jerusalem decades earlier by Nebuchadnezzar, be brought forth. These objects, consecrated to the God of Israel, are now used for a blasphemous toast to the gods of gold, silver, bronze, and stone. The feast reaches a fever pitch of sacrilege, and then, in the flickering lamplight, it happens. A disembodied human hand appears and begins to write 4 cryptic Aramaic words on the white plaster of the wall: Min, Min, Tekel, Upharsin. The king's face pales, his knees knock together in terror. His wise men are baffled. Only the exiled Hebrew prophet Daniel can decipher the ominous message. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The story concludes with a stark, chilling finality. That very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. This scene from the 5th chapter of the book of Daniel is one of the most iconic in all of Western literature. It has inspired artists from Rembrandt to William Blake, and the phrase, "the writing on the wall," has entered our common language as a universal symbol of an inevitable and dire fate. But when we place this powerful drama alongside the dry administrative records from Babylon itself, we enter a fascinating space between history and legend. The historical core of the story is surprisingly sturdy. Babylonian cuneiform tablets confirm that Belshazzar was a very real historical figure. He was the eldest son of Nabonidus and served as the crown prince and regent of the kingdom during his father's 10-year absence in Tama. Administrative documents from this period are dated to the reign of Nabonidus, king of Babylon, but also note the presence of Belshazzar, the son of the king, in the capital, clearly indicating he was the man in charge. So, the central character of the biblical story is not a fictional invention. However, the Babylonian records are completely silent on the events of that specific night. There is no mention of a grand feast, no record of a mysterious omen, and no account of Belshazzar being killed during the Persian takeover. In fact, the primary Babylonian source, the Nabonidus Chronicle, states that Cyrus entered Babylon peacefully and that Nabonidus was captured later and sent into exile, with no mention of his son's fate at all. This silence is deafening. If the regent of Babylon had been slain in a dramatic palace coup on the very night the empire fell, it seems almost certain that such a momentous event would have been noted, even in the sparse style of official chronicles. Its absence forces us to consider the story of Belshazzar's feast not as a literal news report, but as something else entirely, a profound theological parable crafted for a specific audience with a powerful message to convey. The primary purpose of the story was to provide hope and a framework of meaning for the Jewish people living in exile. For them, Babylon was the ultimate symbol of oppressive power, the empire that had destroyed their temple, laid waste to their homeland, and carried them off into captivity. The idea that this seemingly invincible empire could be brought down by a mere army was insufficient. Its collapse needed a deeper, cosmic explanation. The tale of Belshazzar's feast provides exactly that. It transforms a complex geopolitical event into a clear story of divine judgment. The king's act of sacrilege using the holy vessels is the ultimate expression of hubris, a direct challenge to the authority of the God of Israel. The writing on the wall is the divine response, a supernatural intervention that demonstrates God's sovereignty over all nations, even the greatest empire on earth. The story functions as a perfect narrative sandwich, bookended by the themes of pride and fall. It begins with Belshazzar at the height of his power, feasting in arrogant security while the enemy, unbeknownst to him, is at the gates. It ends with his utter humiliation and death. This structure is a classic literary device found in many ancient texts, designed to teach a moral lesson about the fleeting nature of human power and the certainty of justice. The message to the Jewish exiles was clear: your God is still in control. The kings of the earth may seem all-powerful, but they are ultimately accountable to a higher authority. Their empires are numbered, they will be weighed and found wanting, and their power will be divided. This narrative gave a traumatized people a sense of cosmic order and the hope that their own suffering would not be in vain. The power of this story lies in its ability to take a probable historical kernel, that there was some kind of celebration or official gathering in the palace on the eve of the conquest, and elevate it into a timeless myth. It is entirely plausible that Belshazzar and his court were holding a feast, perhaps even the Akitu festival, while Cyrus's forces were executing their clever stratagem. The panic and confusion that would have erupted when the Persians suddenly appeared inside the city could easily have been remembered and retold as a story of a king struck down by a supernatural omen. Over generations, as the story was passed down among the Jewish diaspora, it was refined and dramatized, its details sharpened to maximize its theological impact. The historical Belshazzar, a capable but politically hampered regent, was transformed into the archetypal arrogant tyrant. The likely chaotic and opportunistic Persian attack was recast as the direct fulfillment of a divine prophecy delivered moments before the fact. This process is not about deception, it is about meaning-making. It shows how communities use stories to process trauma, assert their identity, and explain the seemingly inexplicable turns of history. The legend of Belshazzar's feast endures not because it is a perfectly accurate historical record, but because it is a profoundly true story about the limits of arrogance and the enduring hope for justice. After the dramatic flourishes of prophets and historians, the voice of Babylon itself is almost shockingly plain. It comes to us not from a grand monument or a poetic scroll, but from a series of humble clay tablets, inscribed with the precise, wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform. These are the Babylonian chronicles, the official year-by-year record kept by the state's own scribes. For a historian searching for the unvarnished truth, this should be the ultimate source, the closest we can get to a news report from the night the empire fell. Yet, when we find the entry for the 16th year of King Nabonidus, the year we know as 539 before the Common Era, we are met not with a detailed account, but with a profound and frustrating silence. The entry is breathtakingly brief. It states matter-of-factly that Cyrus attacked the Babylonian army at a place called Opis, defeated it, and then, on the 14th day of the month Tashritu, without any battle, he entered Babylon. The text continues, noting that Nabonidus was captured when he returned to the city, and that Cyrus sent greetings to all the people of Babylon, appointing local governors. And that is it. The single most important night in the city's long history is summarized in a few bureaucratic sentences, devoid of any emotion, any drama, any explanation. The contrast with the other retellings could not be more stark. Where the Book of Daniel gives us a disembodied hand and a terrified king, the Chronicle gives us administrative procedure. Where Herodotus spins a tale of diverted rivers and drunken feasts, the Chronicle notes the appointment of officials. This stark, unadorned style is the nature of the Chronicles themselves. They were not written to entertain or to inspire. They were functional documents akin to a modern government's official logbook. Their purpose was to record the key events of each regnal year, military campaigns, religious rituals, astronomical phenomena, in a standardized, impersonal format. There was no room for editorializing or for describing the fear in the streets or the chaos in the palace. The silence on these details is in part simply a reflection of the genre. The scribes were doing their job, and their job was to record what happened, not how it felt. But could there be more to this silence than just bureaucratic style? One compelling theory is that this terse entry is itself a form of early propaganda, but one issued under the watchful eye of the new Persian administration. After taking power, Cyrus would have had a strong interest in stabilizing his new territory. A chronicle that described a violent, bloody conquest could inspire resentment and rebellion among the conquered population. But a chronicle that simply stated he entered without battle presents the takeover as a smooth, inevitable, and peaceful transition of power. It normalizes the new regime from day one. The scribes who compiled the Chronicle after the fact may have been working under direct instructions from their new Persian overseers to downplay any resistance or conflict. By omitting any mention of a struggle, the official record effectively erases it, creating a historical narrative that serves the interests of the victor. In this light, the Chronicle's brevity is not an absence of information, but a deliberate act of curation. Another possibility is that the silence reflects a profound cultural trauma. For the Babylonian scribes, the fall of their world empire was a cataclysm so immense that it was almost unspeakable. How could they possibly capture the humiliation, the fear, and the shock of seeing a foreign king take the throne of Marduk? In the face of such an event, the dry, formulaic language of the Chronicle may have been a psychological coping mechanism. By reducing the fall to a simple administrative notation, they could maintain a sense of order and control in their record-keeping, even as their world was turned upside down. It is a way of containing the chaos within the familiar structure of their profession. The greatest tragedies are sometimes recorded with the fewest words, not because they are unimportant, but because they are too important for words to adequately capture. When we examine the specific wording, the phrase "without battle" is particularly loaded. Does it mean there was literally no fighting whatsoever, as the Cyrus cylinder claims? Or could it mean that there was no major pitched battle for the city itself, that the Persians achieved their objective through a swift, surgical operation that bypassed the need for a protracted street-by-street conflict? The attack at Opis, mentioned just before, suggests there was indeed military engagement. The Babylonian army was defeated in the field, which may have broken its ability to mount a coordinated defense of the capital. The entry about Cyrus entering without battle could therefore mean that the city's defenders, demoralized and leaderless, offered no organized resistance once the Persian forces were inside the walls. This interpretation bridges the gap between the peaceful Persian narrative and the more dramatic traditions. It allows for the possibility of confined violence, a struggle at the palace to capture Belshazzar, for instance, that would not qualify as a battle in the formal sense the chroniclers used. This first-hand account, so close to the event, ultimately forces us to confront the most fundamental challenge of studying ancient history: the limitations of our sources. The Babylonian Chronicle is a priceless document, but it is not a transparent window into the past. It is a text written by fallible humans with their own biases, working within a specific literary tradition, and likely under significant political pressure. Its silences are as telling as its statements. The vivid, multi-civilization retellings from the Persians, Greeks, and Jews give us color, emotion, and meaning, but they are layers of interpretation added at a distance. The Babylonian Chronicle gives us the bare bones of the event, but those bones are arranged in a way that may hide as much as they reveal. The truth of that night likely lies somewhere in the gap between the dramatic stories and the silent official record, in the space between what was shouted to the world and what was left unspoken by the scribes of a fallen empire. This elusive quality is what makes the mystery so enduring. We are left to piece together the reality from whispers and echoes, forever fascinated by the secrets the past chooses to keep. The most formidable fortress in the world is not made of brick and mortar, but of the collective belief of the people living within it. The true conquest of Babylon may have begun not with shovels diverting a river, but with whispers carefully seeded into the minds of its citizens long before the first Persian soldier set foot on the riverbed. This was a campaign of psychological warfare, a masterful effort to break the will of the Babylonians before a single stone of their legendary walls was ever touched. Cyrus the Great understood that to capture an empire, you must first capture the narrative, transforming yourself in the public imagination from a foreign invader into a liberating hero. The physical siege was almost the final, ceremonial act in a battle for hearts and minds that had already been largely won. The centerpiece of this information campaign is the Cyrus cylinder itself, but its genius lies not just in what it said after the conquest, but in the promises it likely echoed that were circulated beforehand. Think of the powerful message that would have been smuggled into the city through merchants, travelers, and sympathetic priests. Cyrus was not coming to destroy Babylon or erase its gods. On the contrary, he was coming to restore them. He promised to return the statues of the deities to their rightful temples, a direct appeal to the priestly class of Marduk, who had been so deeply alienated by Nabonidus's focus on the moon god Sin. For these influential religious leaders, the promise of a return to prominence and proper ritual was an incredibly potent incentive to welcome the new regime. This was a targeted message designed to turn the empire's most powerful internal faction against its own king. The cultivation of a fifth column within the city walls would have been a critical component of this strategy. It is highly plausible that Persian agents posing as diplomats, merchants, or even refugees were active in Babylon for months or even years, identifying points of discontent and forging alliances with disgruntled nobles and military officers. These collaborators would have provided invaluable intelligence, not just on fortifications and troop deployments, but on the city's morale, the popularity of the ruling family, and the perfect timing for an attack. The choice to strike during the Akitu festival, a time of both religious fervor and potential political tension, reeks of insider knowledge. Someone on the inside would have known that the gates might be open, that the guards' attention would be divided, and that the king's son, Belshazzar, would be presiding over ceremonies that highlighted his limited substitute authority. This internal network would have also been tasked with spreading demoralizing rumors, exaggerating the size of the Persian army, questioning the leadership of Nabonidus, and amplifying the message of Cyrus as the chosen one of Marduk. The impact of this sustained psychological pressure on the morale of the Babylonian army cannot be overstated. A soldier's will to fight is rooted in the belief that his cause is just and that his leaders are legitimate. What happens to that will when whispers suggest that their own chief god has rejected their king? When they hear that the great Cyrus promises to honor their traditions and not punish them for their loyalty to the previous regime, the defeat of the Babylonian army at Opis, just before the march on Babylon, would have been a devastating blow, but the psychological groundwork would have made that defeat feel like an inevitability rather than a setback. By the time the Persians were reportedly wading through the river gates, the defending forces may have been so demoralized, so uncertain of their cause, and so aware of internal dissent that organized resistance crumbled. The phrase from the Babylonian Chronicle that Cyrus entered without battle may not describe a complete absence of conflict, but a collapse of the collective will to resist. This sophisticated approach to conquest marks a pivotal moment in the history of warfare. Cyrus was not merely a brilliant tactician, he was an early master of what we would now call soft power and information operations. He recognized that the most durable empires are built on consent, or at least acquiescence, and that this could be engineered through a careful blend of promises, propaganda, and the exploitation of existing fissures within a society. The strategy employed at Babylon would become a model for future conquerors, from Alexander the Great to the Romans, who understood that to hold a territory, you must first convince a significant portion of its people that their lives will be better, or at least no worse, under your rule. The fall of Babylon, therefore, stands as a timeless lesson in the art of power. It demonstrates that the strongest walls are ultimately no match for a well-told story, a cleverly exploited grievance, and a campaign that targets the mind as decisively as it targets the city gates. Now we arrive at the heart of our mystery, the moment where we place these competing stories side by side and listen to the fascinating conversation between them. Imagine a historian's desk illuminated by a single lamp. Upon it rests the smooth, barrel-shaped form of the Cyrus cylinder, the crisp pages of Herodotus's histories, and the ancient scroll of the Book of Daniel. Each of these artifacts speaks of the same night, the same city, the same empire falling, yet they tell three fundamentally different tales. By comparing their core narratives, we stop simply learning about history and start learning how history is made. How a single event is fractured into 1,000 reflections by the lenses of culture, faith, and power. The convergences between these accounts give us a skeleton of probable fact, while the wild divergences reveal the flesh and blood of human meaning-making. Let's first look at where these stories agree, the points of convergence that form the bedrock of the historical event. All three traditions unequivocally state that Babylon fell to Cyrus the Great. This is a crucial common thread. They also agree on the outcome. The Neo-Babylonian Empire ceased to exist, and the Achaemenid Persian Empire took its place. Furthermore, there is a shared understanding that this was a swift event, not a long, drawn-out siege lasting years. The capture of the city happened with a surprising suddenness that left a deep impression on everyone who recorded it. Even the method, in a broad sense, finds some agreement. Both the Persian and Greek accounts involve the Euphrates River playing a key role, suggesting that the city's aquatic artery was central to the strategy of its capture. These points of overlap are our most reliable guideposts. They tell us that, at a minimum, Cyrus led a Persian army that captured Babylon relatively quickly, likely using the river in some capacity. This is the historical core around which the legends were built, but it is in the dramatic divergences where the true colors of each civilization shine through. The most striking difference lies in the portrayal of violence and the nature of the conquest. The Persian narrative, as told by the Cyrus cylinder, is one of near total peace. It describes a liberation, a bloodless entry welcomed by the people and the gods. In stark contrast, the Greek and biblical traditions are drenched in drama and death. Herodotus implies a clever but forceful takeover, while the Book of Daniel vividly describes the assassination of the king on the very night of the invasion. This chasm reflects the primary purpose of each account. For Cyrus, the goal was political stability. His story is a press release designed to legitimize his rule. For the Greeks and the Jews, the goal was moral and theological instruction. Their stories require a violent, dramatic fall to serve as a punishment for hubris and a testament to divine power. We can distill these differences into three powerful thematic lenses. First, the Persian narrative of liberation and legitimacy. Here, Cyrus is a rational, strategic statesman. The fall of Babylon is a political and military achievement, framed as a restoration of correct religious order after the neglect of Nabonidus. The event is presented as a positive transition, a change in management that benefited everyone. Second, we have the Greek narrative of moral decay and hubris. Through this lens, the Babylonians are not liberated but punished. Their downfall is a direct consequence of their own internal corruption, arrogance, and decadence, as epitomized by the legendary feast of Belshazzar. This is history as a morality play, where the flaws of character inevitably lead to a catastrophic collapse. Finally, there is the biblical narrative of divine judgment and prophecy. This perspective removes human agency almost entirely. Cyrus is not a brilliant strategist but an unwitting instrument of God's will. The fall of Babylon is not a political or moral event, but a theological one, the fulfillment of a cosmic plan that brings justice to the oppressed and judgment to the oppressor. So why did these civilizations need to tell the story in such radically different ways? The answer lies in what the event meant for their own identity and worldview. For the fledgling Persian Empire, the conquest of Babylon was their entry onto the world stage. Their narrative had to justify their rule over a vast, multicultural domain. The liberation story was brilliant propaganda, assuring all subject peoples that Persian rule meant respect and tolerance, not subjugation. For the Greeks, particularly those like Herodotus who were defining themselves in opposition to the vast Persian Empire, the story of Babylon's fall served as a cautionary tale about the inherent weakness of Eastern despotism. It reinforced Greek values of moderation and civic virtue by showing the terrible price of their opposite. For the Jewish people, the event was nothing less than a validation of their entire faith during a period of profound trauma. The fall of their mighty captor proved that their God was real, was powerful, and was faithful to his promises. It was a story that gave meaning to their suffering and hope for their future. What, then, can we reasonably conclude happened on that night? The convergent evidence suggests a capture that was strategically brilliant and likely exploited significant internal discontent. The archaeological lack of widespread destruction supports the idea that it was not a city-wide sack. The most plausible scenario is a hybrid of the accounts. Cyrus, aware of the political strife caused by Nabonidus, used psychological warfare and promises of restoration to gain allies within the city. His engineers executed a daring plan to use the river during a festival, allowing a small force to enter and seize key points. There may have been confined violence at the palace, a struggle that could have resulted in Belshazzar's death, but not a general massacre. The writing on the wall and the disembodied hand are powerful metaphors for the palpable sense of impending doom that must have gripped the Babylonian leadership, who knew their rule was brittle. This comparative approach does not give us a single, easy truth. Instead, it gives us something richer, an understanding that history is not a recording but an interpretation. The fall of Babylon is not one story but three, and by holding them all in our hands at once, we see not just the event, but the faces of the civilizations who remembered it, each seeing in its collapse a reflection of their own fears, their own values, and their own place in the world. The first light of dawn over Babylon did not reveal a city in ruins, but a metropolis holding its breath. Instead of the chaotic sounds of looting and the clash of swords, the morning air carried the measured footsteps of Persian soldiers taking up positions at key gates and the voices of officials reading proclamations in the city squares. The message was not one of subjugation, but of continuity and restoration. This was the dawn of Cyrus's policy of tolerance, a revolutionary approach to empire that would become his most enduring legacy. While other conquerors sought to erase the cultures they subdued, Cyrus understood that true power lay not in destruction, but in incorporation. His goal was not to rule over ashes, but to preside over a thriving, multicultural domain where diverse peoples could maintain their identities while swearing allegiance to a single, distant throne. This was a seismic shift in ancient statecraft, transforming the fall of Babylon from a catastrophic ending into the beginning of a new, more sophisticated era of imperial rule. The cornerstone of this policy is immortalized in the Cyrus Cylinder, an artifact that functions as one of history's first known charters of human rights. Beyond its use as propaganda to justify the conquest, the cylinder laid out a practical blueprint for governance. It declared that Cyrus would uphold the traditions and religions of all the peoples now under his sway. He returned the statues of various gods to their plundered cities, allowing local cults to be restored. He repatriated displaced populations, most famously granting the Jewish exiles permission to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This was not merely an act of benevolence, it was an act of brilliant political calculus. By presenting himself as the restorer of divine order, he effectively co-opted the loyalty of the priestly classes across his empire. These influential leaders became natural allies of the new regime, using their pulpits to preach the legitimacy of Persian rule as a divine blessing. The cost of this policy was negligible compared to the expense of garrisoning troops to suppress constant rebellions. It was, in essence, a strategy of winning hearts and minds on a continental scale. The practical benefits of this approach for stabilizing a vast, multicultural empire were immediate and profound. An empire stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea was simply too large and too diverse to be held together by brute force alone. A revolt in Egypt could not be put down quickly if the army was busy dealing with an uprising in Bactria. Cyrus's tolerance created a system of voluntary compliance. By allowing conquered peoples to keep their lands, practice their religions, and largely govern their own local affairs under the watchful eye of a Persian satrap or governor, he gave them a vested interest in the empire's stability. Their economic prosperity was now tied to the Pax Persica, the Persian peace. Trade routes became safer, commerce flourished, and the flow of taxes to the imperial treasury became more reliable. This model of indirect rule became the secret to the Achaemenid Empire's remarkable longevity, setting a precedent that would influence every great empire that followed, from Alexander's Hellenistic kingdoms to the Roman Empire itself. For the Jewish people, Cyrus's decree was nothing short of miraculous. After decades of captivity, the words of the prophet Jeremiah, who had foretold a 70-year exile, were being fulfilled. The Book of Ezra records the stunning edict. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem." This was not just permission to return, it was official sanction and support, including the return of the sacred temple vessels that had been looted by Nebuchadnezzar. The psychological impact was immense. It validated their faith and gave them a new identity as a people restored. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus is accorded a unique status called God's Anointed, a term of immense respect. This relationship illustrates the perfect symmetry of Cyrus's policy. He gained the unwavering loyalty of a strategically important community on the western edge of his empire, while they gained their freedom and the chance to reclaim their homeland. It was a partnership of mutual benefit, engineered by a ruler who saw diversity not as a threat but as a strength. The aftermath of Babylon's fall, therefore, was not a story of endings but of transformations. The city itself did not disappear into obscurity. It remained a vital administrative and cultural center within the Persian Empire, its wealth and knowledge now serving a new master. The mighty walls that had failed to keep Cyrus out now protected his governors. The sophisticated Babylonian bureaucracy, with its army of scribes and accountants, was seamlessly integrated into the imperial administration, their record-keeping skills essential for managing the empire's vast resources. The night the city fell marked the precise moment when the center of gravity in the ancient world shifted irrevocably. The era of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was over, but the even more grand and influential era of the Achaemenid Persian Empire had begun. This transition demonstrated that the greatest conquests are not those that destroy, but those that absorb and transform, building something new and more resilient upon the foundations of the old. Cyrus's policy of tolerance ensured that the echo of Babylon's fall was not a crash of collapse, but the steady, confident hum of an empire learning how to rule the world. But the story of Babylon's fall did not remain frozen in the clay tablets and scrolls of antiquity. Its echo traveled through centuries, waiting for new civilizations to hear it and find their own meaning in its resonance. As the Roman Empire gave way to the Middle Ages and the intellectual fires of the Renaissance were lit, the ancient tale was rediscovered, dusted off, and held up to the light by thinkers who saw in its collapse a reflection of their own world's anxieties and aspirations. The multi-civilization retelling did not end with the Persians, Greeks, and Jews. It simply entered a new chapter, with each successive generation reinterpreting the event through its own distinct philosophical and political lens. The fall of Babylon became a versatile and powerful symbol, a blank canvas upon which every era could paint its own fears about power, morality, and the fate of empires. In the great stone cathedrals of medieval Europe, the story of Babylon was transformed into a vivid moral allegory for the Christian faithful. Here, the city was not a historical place but a spiritual concept, the ultimate symbol of worldly pride and vanity, a sinful contrast to the heavenly Jerusalem. Artists carved the Tower of Babel, often conflated with the later Babylon, into the facades of churches, its builders forever scrambling in confusion as a divine hand scrambled their language. This image served as a constant reminder of the futility of human ambition without God. The most potent symbol from this period was not the city's fall, but the figure of Belshazzar's feast, which became a popular subject for painters like Rembrandt. In these dark, dramatic works, the focus is on the moment of divine judgment, the mysterious hand, the terror on the king's face, the spilled golden cups. For medieval and Renaissance viewers, this was not a lesson about a specific ancient empire. It was a warning about the transient nature of all earthly power and the suddenness with which God could call the proud and wicked to account. Babylon became a shorthand for the corrupting allure of material wealth and the inevitable downfall that awaited those who placed their faith in it instead of in divine salvation. Then, with the intellectual earthquake of the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, the story was reinterpreted once again, this time through the cool, rational light of philosophy. For thinkers like Montesquieu and Edward Gibbon, the fall of Babylon was no longer a divine morality play but a sobering case study in political science. They examined the event not as an act of God, but as a consequence of flawed systems and human failings. In their writings, Babylon's collapse became a powerful argument against the very concept of absolute monarchy and Eastern despotism, which Enlightenment philosophers saw as inherently unstable. The eccentricity of Nabonidus, the decadence of Belshazzar, and the sheer size of the empire were analyzed as factors that led to internal weakness and vulnerability. For these scholars, the story demonstrated that no empire, no matter how magnificent its walls, could survive if its rulers became tyrannical, neglected their duties, or lost the support of their people. The Persian conquest, in this view, was almost a natural political correction, the replacement of a corrupt and stagnant regime with a more pragmatic and tolerant one. The fall of Babylon was thus weaponized as a historical precedent in the Enlightenment's broader battle against arbitrary power and in favor of more reasoned, representative forms of government. This repurposing of the story continued into the modern era, where it found a strange and powerful new life in the United States. The fledgling American Republic, defining itself in opposition to the old monarchies of Europe, saw a kind of parallel in the ancient world. Early American writers and preachers frequently used Babylon as a metaphor for the corruption and tyranny of the British Crown. The phrase, "Babylon is fallen," appeared in revolutionary pamphlets and sermons, framing the struggle for independence as a righteous overthrow of a modern-day empire of oppression. This symbolism was powerfully inverted during the 20th century, particularly during the Cold War. For many American commentators, the Soviet Union itself became the new Babylon, a vast, atheistic, and oppressive empire that, according to this logic, was destined for the same collapse as its ancient predecessor. This usage demonstrates the incredible flexibility of the symbol. It could be applied to any powerful entity perceived as morally bankrupt or tyrannical, regardless of its political ideology. Even in our contemporary world, the ghost of Babylon's fall continues to haunt our imagination. It appears in popular culture, from epic films to dystopian literature, often as a stand-in for any great civilization that overreaches and collapses under the weight of its own complexity. Environmentalists might point to Babylon as an early example of an unsustainable society, overly dependent on complex irrigation systems and vulnerable to ecological shifts. Political analysts still invoke it when discussing the perceived decline of modern superpowers, drawing parallels between ancient vulnerabilities and contemporary challenges like political polarization, economic inequality, and military overstretch. The enduring power of the story lies in this very adaptability. It provides a master narrative of rise and fall that feels universally true, a template we can apply to any situation where towering ambition meets a precipitous collapse. The multi-civilization retelling continues today, with each generation asking the same fundamental question of the ancient ruins. Are we looking at a relic of the past or a reflection of our own future? The long shadow of Babylon's fall proves that history is never truly dead. It is a conversation that stretches across millennia, and we are all still participants in it. They were the ultimate symbol of security, a statement in baked brick and bitumen that dared any enemy to even try. The walls of Babylon were not merely defensive structures, they were a psychological weapon designed to project an image of such overwhelming strength that the very idea of an attack would seem laughable. Ancient historians like Herodotus and the later Greek writer Ctesias described them in almost mythical terms, a triple-layered system of defense that seemed to defy the military technology of the age. The main inner wall, called Imger-Enlil, was so thick that 2 4-horse chariots could pass each other on its ramparts. Beyond it lay a second, slightly narrower outer wall, and beyond that, a massive moat filled by the Euphrates River itself. The total width of this defensive complex was staggering, estimated by some ancient sources to be over 80 feet across. For any commander looking up at those soaring battlements, the message was clear. A direct assault would be nothing short of suicide, a futile waste of lives against an impregnable fortress. This was the myth of invincibility that Cyrus the Great had to shatter. To understand how he might have done it, we need to move beyond the general descriptions and look at the specific, clever vulnerabilities engineered into the city's very design. The greatest of these was also the city's lifeblood, the Euphrates River. It flowed directly through the center of Babylon, entering and exiting through massive gates set within the walls. These river gates were the city's logistical Achilles heel. They were essential for trade, communication, and drainage, but they also represented a potential entry point, a hole in the otherwise seamless defensive perimeter. The Babylonians were not naive. These gates would have been heavily fortified with bronze bars and guarded by towers, but any gate, no matter how strong, is only as secure as the vigilance of those who guard it. This single feature transforms the problem of conquest from the impossible task of breaking through 80 feet of wall to the more manageable, though still immensely difficult, task of finding a way through a heavily defended but finite gateway. This is where the various historical accounts converge on a single, brilliant tactic, the diversion of the river. The story, as told by Greek historians like Herodotus and Xenophon, describes Cyrus ordering his army to dig a massive canal upstream, diverting the flow of the Euphrates away from its main channel and into a nearby swamp. The goal was not to stop the river entirely, but to lower its water level significantly as it passed through the city. Imagine the scene. Over weeks or months, thousands of Persian soldiers labor with shovels and baskets, slowly but surely redirecting the flow of one of the world's great rivers. If successful, the water level within the city walls would drop to little more than a thigh-deep stream. Suddenly, the riverbed itself becomes a road, and the fortified river gates are left high and dry, accessible to soldiers on foot. This was not a siege in the traditional sense of surrounding and starving a city. It was a breathtaking feat of hydrological engineering, a plan that required patience, resources, and an intimate knowledge of the landscape. But could such a plan have actually worked? Military historians have long debated its feasibility. The Euphrates is a powerful river, and diverting it, even partially, would have been a Herculean effort. Some scholars argue that the water pressure against the gates would have remained too strong, or that the riverbed would have been an impassable quagmire of mud and silt. However, others point to the advanced engineering capabilities of the Persians, who managed vast irrigation projects across their empire. The timing also makes it plausible. The attack is believed to have occurred in October, after the annual spring floods had subsided and the river was at its lowest ebb. A carefully planned diversion at this time of year could have significantly reduced the flow. Furthermore, the strategy aligns perfectly with Cyrus's broader approach of winning a campaign with minimal bloodshed. a direct assault would have cost thousands of lives and left a valuable city in ruins. A clever bypass, if it worked, would deliver the empire's greatest prize largely intact. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle is the human element, the festival of Akitu. The ancient sources suggest that Cyrus's operation was perfectly synchronized with this major Babylonian New Year celebration. During Akitu, the entire city, including its military defenders, would have been immersed in days of religious processions, public feasting, and ritual ceremonies. It was a time of heightened spiritual significance but potentially lowered military vigilance. The guards at the river gates, normally alert, might have been distracted, reduced in number, or even participating in the festivities. This creates a scenario where the Persians, having lowered the river, could send a specialized team of soldiers through the riverbed under the cover of darkness. Their objective would not be to fight the entire Babylonian army in the streets, but to perform a swift, surgical strike. They would seize the river gates from the inside, open them for a larger force waiting outside, and then move quickly to capture the palace and citadel, decapitating the leadership before a coordinated defense could be mounted. This combination of engineering, timing, and tactical surprise makes the river diversion theory the most compelling explanation for the breach. It accounts for the lack of archaeological evidence for a large-scale battle, and it turns the city's greatest strength, its sophisticated water-based infrastructure, into the very instrument of its downfall. The legendary walls of Babylon, for all their immense physical power, were ultimately overcome not by force, but by a combination of ingenuity, patience, and a deep understanding of the enemy's culture and habits.